there. So we finished up with strain theory. Okay, we're talking about criminal theories of deviance. We're going to talk about strain theory, which we already did, differential association theory, control theory, and labeling theory. The others we're going to kind of leave aside, not that they're not important, but I'm just going to focus on these. And again, here's the important thing. I do want you guys to recognize these different kinds of adaptation. If you recall, okay, the one that falls within this chapter focuses innovation. And remember, it's this whole idea. I'm going to just reprise really quickly. Okay, Robert K. Merton is borrowing Emil Durkheim's kind of view of deviant behavior, in particular suicide. And basically for Durkheim, it was the way in which ideas or beliefs or values of the collective consciousness matched or did not match kind of the structural possibilities allowed, okay, within a society. So when your expectations, your view of the good life is out of step with what, the world can actually give you at the moment, you experience this kind of strain or gap. Okay, so what Merton says is, in an American society, we're basically showered, bathed with the kind of materialistic standards of success. Okay, to become something in the world, okay, you got to earn a certain amount of money, you got to have the right kinds of stuff, clothes, and all that kind of stuff, this big old package that constitutes what we could call the American dream. So he calls that the cultural goal. Okay, and just how you read this again, take conformity. Conformity, you fit into this, what he calls adaptation. If you've really adopted that, you've taken that in, this American dream, it exercises an influence on you. It makes you want certain things in life. You may have other kinds of values, other ways of judging your behavior, whether you're a success in the world and so on, but this materialistic sense of how you should judge yourself really does exercise an influence on you, okay? So you have that as a goal, that's the positive. And then institutionalized means just a fancy way of saying legal means of income, legal means of getting hold of that stuff, of realizing the American dream. So you have the goal, you have the legal means, conformity. Innovation is when you have the goal, it exercises a really strong pressure on you, but there's some blockage. You don't have the means, you don't have the income, you don't live in the right place, you don't grow up in the right kind of family, et cetera, et cetera. And it's as though there's a block, a dam, something that gets in the way that impedes your realization of the American dream. But since it still exercises a powerful force, you feel a strain, oppression, and it leads you to realize the American dream in some other way than legal, right? So you break the law. He calls that innovation. You could call that a kind of clever euphemism. He would say it's a more neutral way. It's a non-judgmental way of kind of describing this behavior scientifically. And then there's ritualism, retreatism, rebellion. I'm not going to go over those again. You will be asked about them in the quiz. Here's where I wanted to sort of leave off, and I think I might start using this tool again. I really like drawing because I'm a really kind of a visual thinker, actually, and plus it's kind of fun to draw on this stuff. Anyway, I wanted to bring up some noted shortcomings of this theory. I wanted to note one thing, that this is often referred to, and I think I mentioned this last time around, as an economic determinist theory. It largely says that structural economic factors determine the way in which people are going to behave, because it basically assumes that everyone's going to be socialized in the American dream in the same way. That is the assumption that it makes, okay? By the way, that assumption is something you could ask whether or not it's correct. Is it the case that all people in all kinds of subcultures, walks of life, and so on are socialized in the American dream in the same way, to the same extent? Do they all interpret it the same? Okay, socialized, we'll say equally in the cultural goal? I'll just put down American Dream. M3. Biggest problem with this tool is it's hard to write with. I got to find some kind of alternative to the mouse. Okay, but it's also, so there's that. That's a question. Okay, and people who kind of sprung off of, come up with alternative theories that branch from this have basically kind of tried to open up this assumption. Say there's different subcultures that have different ways of like, you know, determining success or failure or what have you. Economic determinism, it leads to one thing it leads to, and I mentioned this the last time around, is a kind of prediction, whereas over time, as the economy, okay, gets better or gets worse, or gets better or gets worse, crime has an inverted relationship to it, or a negative relationship. So as the economy gets better, crime goes down. As the economy gets worse, crime goes up, and so on and so forth, right? Because people are feeling more strain because they're losing, or they have fewer institutionalized means of realizing that goal, and so resort to other means. And then some people say this is psychologically unrealistic. And I'll just put psychologically unrealistic, because it tells the following kind of story. Think of somebody who's been working for decades and decades, 3-4 decades, and you know, just a regular kind of job. I mean, a law-abiding citizen who's more or less been in this conformity measure of things for his whole life. And then one day the economy takes a little turn and he loses his job. He gets handed a pink slip and he says, you're no longer going to be making the kind of income that you did before. And even if you qualify for, you know, unemployment benefits, as you probably will, your life is going to take a big hit, right? And you're going to have to start downsizing your cultural goals. But he's not able to do that, right? Okay, he's not able to do that. And so the idea is that after living a kind of law-abiding existence for several decades, he's suddenly feeling this enormous amount of pressure, hits the streets, turns to a life of crime, starts robbing places, holds up banks, you know, mugs people, and so on and so forth. They say that's probably unrealistic. For somebody to change their mentality and behavior and habits and so on and so forth, and especially to do it with any measure of success, is probably highly unlikely. It's the stuff of like dramatic stories, okay? So it might make for a good movie, but it probably isn't that true of most people, okay? That's one criticism. So let me now turn to some of the alternative theories. One of them which tries to sort of compensate for that lack of realism, and that's going to be differential association theory. So differential association theory. All right, so Sutherland and a few other guys. There's a guy named McKay. He was another famous name. People a long time ago, 1930s, 1940s, you know, a good while ago, getting close to a century ago, developed this theory, and they're working out of Chicago. They're working out of the University of Chicago. And Darius, I remember you mentioning this theory of like parenting styles, Bronfenbrenner, and something like they call this theory an ecological theory. And actually, these guys developed what was called the Chicago School, and it was kind of an ecological theory in that it actually tried to map the social world in the way that biological ecologists do, that there's these different environmental conditions in which certain kinds of things grow, here, not like, you know, plants and animals and so on, but certain kinds of social formations, behaviors, and so on. And you could like map out the different kinds of habitats, you know, within a city. That's kind of beside the point, but just an interesting connection. And here's what they noticed. Their theory came from observing something in the 1930s in Chicago. And one thing about Chicago in the 1930s, it was a city that was undergoing very quick, rapid, dramatic demographic transformation in the composition, especially the ethnic composition of the population due to migration. Migration actually, until recently, when China's internal population started moving from the country to the city, this was like the single biggest international domestic wave of migration in the history of the world, in which people from the South, mostly African Americans in the South, started moving up into the northern metropolitan areas because they were attracted largely by the possibilities for factory labor there. And Chicago was one of the great hubs of the movement. But at the same time, over the previous decades, there had also been another massive wave of external migration. So people from Europe in particular, people from like the Mediterranean areas, Italy, Greece, but also Poland, et cetera, et cetera. And both of these kinds of waves kind of slapping the shores of Chicago. And what this led to is the different kind of older settled neighborhoods and communities in Chicago were seeing new people move in. And very often that meant older people move out if they felt uncomfortable, you know, with the newcomers, and which many of them did. Okay, so what you saw was a lot of turnover, okay, in the composition, the ethnic composition, okay, and actually present day Chicago in many ways, you know, it's got its you know, it's Little Italy there, you know, it's Polish area and so on and so forth, areas that are seen as more classically African, that's kind of all an outcome of these early kind of patterns of settlement and movement. In any event, here's what they saw. With all this turnover, despite all this turnover, change in the composition, they saw relatively stable rates of juvenile delinquency in given neighborhoods. Okay? So what they pictured in their mind, so here's the picture that they want you to think of, is you got these little neighborhoods, like little pools, as it were, and new people diving in, other people kind of climbing out, okay? But nevertheless, the kind of properties of the pool, in this case, juvenile delinquency rates, remain more or less stable, which led them to conclude that what accounts, okay, largely for criminality, for the kinds of behaviors, the mentalities, skills, habits, and so on that lead to criminality, to robberies and violence and whatever the case may be, was kind of the medium, was the water, which was largely learning, was the influence that was exercised by older members of a kind of subculture, okay? So you have new entrants, okay, into this pool, and they get socialized, okay? Secondary socialization, which we talked about, right? Learning new ways of thinking, new skills, new identities, and so on, okay? Older people moving out, but nevertheless, the culture itself maintains a kind of stability despite its membership changing. And what that led them to do is to say that we need to focus more attention on the influence, okay, that people have on one another, that your associates have on you, whom you associate with, okay, is going to make the biggest difference in their view of whether or not you behave criminally. That's why they use this term, differential association theory, kind of an ugly term, right? But the idea was that, you know, who your associates are, who your peers are, is going to make the biggest difference as to whether or not you're going to become a criminal or not. You're going to become a delinquent and so on, right? Basically peer pressure. But so they called it a learning theory. Okay, it's the crowd you hang out with theory is what I call it, right? The crowd you hang out with is going to make the biggest difference as far as how you behave. Okay, that simple. And here's what they said. They said that that's a more realistic picture. Or people later would compare differential association theory with strain theory and say, yeah, this is more realistic. That guy who suddenly loses his job after like several decades of, living a kind of straight-laced lifestyle. I mean, to imagine that he suddenly overnight turns to a life of crime and has any success at it whatsoever, I mean, that leaves out the fact that usually people come to criminality, and especially any kind of successful or persistent criminality, only through the influence of peers who teach them two different things, not just actual behaviors, practices, ways of doing a robbery, how you actually start a fight, if violent confrontation is the thing we're talking about, but also fundamental ways of looking at the world and values, like saying whether or not, okay, what's regarded as criminal behavior is acceptable or not, is something you ought to do, okay? So essentially what you learn in this theory boils down to these attitudes and skill sets. The kind of attitudes that they have in mind are often, and this actually comes from like a kind of symbolic interactionist view. If you remember this, we talked about definitions of the situation in social interactions. How do you actually define what's going on around you, your interactions, right? So here's the kind of example that they might give, okay? Imagine some kind of really B movie, like lousy script, bad acting, and so on, but the kind of scene that you might find in this kind of, in a movie in the United States of this kind is some rich guy, okay, on some high-powered meeting of executives or whatever, and he's dressed to the nines, and he's wearing a Rolex watch or what have you, somehow loses his way because he's distracted and ends up in a bad part of town, metropolitan center in the United States, and he doesn't know how to find his way out and get to the meeting, so he steps out, and he ends up like, oh, it's in a rough crowd here, right? This is where gang territory or what. And some guy, okay, and here's the criminal. Some guy sees him. He's a member of some gang or what have you, and he go, oh, fresh meat, right? Okay, because the guy steps out and he's lost and he's looking for directions and he needs some help, and he's wearing this Rolex watch and he's driving I don't know, fill in a Ferrari, let's say, okay? Anyway, the rationalization, the definition of the situation that they have in mind is where the guy says to himself something like, does that guy really need a Rolex watch, right? Several $1,000s worth of timekeeping, machinery. Wouldn't it be fine if he just had got himself a little Timex, to $15 Timex from Target? I mean, it still keeps good time. It's just as reliable. And if I made him part ways with his Rolex watch, I mean, there's a lot of good things I could do with that money, right? I could buy something present for mom. I could help my friends out. I could, I get a lot of good uses out of that. I mean, it's going to be fine, right? Now, okay, so that's a rationalization. That's a typical kind, a simple rationalization of the kind we can all tell ourselves. There's nothing sophisticated about it, but okay, and it's called a neutralization technique sometimes, in the sense that what it does is it makes something that's good or bad into something that's neutral. Okay, it sort of robs it of its kind of moral charge, as it were. And it basically says that the harm I'm going to do to you, that is taking away this watch, is no harm at all, okay? And you're not even a victim, okay? Because in fact, what you are is you're a donor. You're donating something to me, right? It retells the story of what happens. So it's a neutralization technique. And here's the important thing to remember. The important thing to remember is that we can all tell this story, but unless we find ourselves amongst a crowd whose members, when they hear that story, will nod their head and say, yeah, dude, that makes a lot of sense. I hear you, right? Unless they validate, right, that story and say that it's a convincing one, you know, all of us here, we're going to go, yeah, that is the kind of thing you would say to yourself if you're a ne'er-do-well, an idiot, one of those guys, right? So that's the power of the social circle, is that through the feedback it gets you, it can make any kind of definition of the situation seem a compelling one in such a way that it'll affect your behavior. You'll behave on the basis of that. And then, okay, that's probably the more important or more difficult kind of, I guess, set of things that's learned to get across. The other one is just basic skills. And what these guys point out is, like, you know, you ought to think of criminality, the criminal behavior, in the way you think of other regions of practical life, in jobs, in sports, and what have you. Okay, it gets a bad rap because it's illegal and it's done by people we often don't have a lot of respect for. Okay, because of the judgments we make. But if you think about it, it's a skill set like any others. Take tennis. You may watch lots and lots of tennis, and that's all you do. You just have a spectator relationship to tennis, and so you watch enough tennis where you're like, I can do that. I know all about it. I know how, you know, all the rules, and I know all the moves and so on. But it's one thing to watch tennis. It's another thing to actually do it. Okay, so similarly, criminality is another kind of hands-on. It requires hands-on kind of practice or rehearsal in order to acquire competence in it. And that's another reason why that story about a person turning to crime overnight, you know, maybe isn't realistic, and you know, what kind of, you know, behavior they go in for. Okay, so that's differential association theory. And I think that's as much. It addresses more of the purely social of the formation of criminality. And, you know, you might be thinking, you know, I still think there might be something to that strain theory, in that it sure seems that economic conditions play some kind of role in the likelihood that crime happens in certain segments of society, right? So if, like these guys here, our focus is on certain areas in American, US American inner cities, that's probably, you know, it's probably not a coincidence that these are also areas where you see some of the worst kinds of economic performance indicators, unemployment rates, per capita income, and so on and so forth. So, and I would say, yeah, many people are totally in agreement. We're not going to go through this theory, but I just wanted to point out very quickly that there are theories. Whoops, this one here, relative opportunity structure, we're not going to talk about it, but it's a theory that tries to combine the insights of both strain theory, which is a structural theory focused on economic objective factors, along with the kinds of micro social interactional contexts by which people come to acquire attitudes and skills. That's all I'm going to say about it. But your best bet, actually, I would say, is to combine those two sets of insights. Control theory. Okay, so this theory here, here's the deal with this one. Here's what I want you to remember, that this theory, control theory, whoops, control theory says motivations to conformity. And so notice this thing here, it asks a different question than the other theories. So one question you could run across would be, what's special about control theory compared to other theories? Here's what other theories do. Other theories make the assumption that unless something goes wrong, we're going to remain law-abiding citizens. We're not going to break the law. We're not criminal by nature. The other theories say that the thing to explain is why some people become criminals, because it kind of assumes that other things being equal, we won't. This theory makes almost the opposite kind of assumption. It kind of assumes that at the starting gate, coming out of the womb, we're all kind of born criminals. It kind of assumes that makes the assumption that Thomas Hobbes assumes, that our brains are kind of wired for selfishness, for egoistic behavior, that what we'll do is we'll put our own interests and desires first, others people secondary, and if other people get in the way of getting what we want, we may do something bad. We may take the stuff they have that we like. We may push them out of the way. We may, in all kinds of ways, act kind of criminally towards them. So this guy named Travis Hershey said, that's what we should assume. We should assume that we're these kinds of desire maximizing creatures who try to get what we want, okay? And, other people, if they get in the way, they're going to be victims. And so the question is how is it that we actually create law-abiding people when we're born, as kind of natural criminals, okay? And so that explains why his theory is called control theory. It's all about controlling these kind of natural, let's call them antisocial impulses. Certain kinds of impulses that lead us to be kind of antisocial, meaning that we kind of violate the rights and feelings of other people, natural antisocial tendencies. Okay, very quickly, he started his work on his theory by questionnaires given to juveniles, people in middle school, maybe even elementary school, high school, and so on. And he got information on them, like family background, also things like, what was their performance in school, their kind of like, record as far as getting in trouble, juvenile delinquency record, but all kinds of questions that had to do with their relationship to other people, especially authority figures, parents and teachers and school administrators, but even outside of school, law enforcement agents, firemen, owners of businesses and clerks and so on and so forth. All the kind of adult population that had some sort of authority or sets of rights and duties, vis-a-vis themselves. How did they feel about these people? Did they admire them? Did they like them? Did they want to spend time with them? Did they want to become like them, et cetera, et cetera? And on the basis of these questions, his insight from what he thought was, this correlation that he thought was, it seems that the more negative people are towards these conventional authority figures, the greater the likelihood of, having some kind of delinquency record. So here's what he thought. Everything, these are kind of 5 pillars of social control, of control over these natural antisocial tendencies. The critical one is this first one called attachment to significant others, and especially parents. So everything begins in Travis Hershey's theory at home, in the, let's call it, the context of primary socialization. Okay, here's how he argued. He called this attachment. If you form really strong, positive, emotionally rich attachments with parents who themselves are law-abiding, what he calls conventional families, that is, they like, keeping their noses clean and having a good, steady, legal source of income and all that, If you form positive, rich attachments to them, that's going to control your behavior from early on, because you're not going to want to violate the laws of the land, get in trouble at school, do any of that kind of stuff, lest it risk your attachment to them, lest it risk severing the bond you have with them, because that would be really painful. It would really hurt. It would be the worst thing, okay? So you kind of cling to convention, to the rules, you obey the laws to maintain those attachments. So that's kind of the first pillar of these 4 pillars. And then the rest kind of follow from it. Then, as you get older, you enter school, you pass through school, especially school. Basically, you as to use the kind of figure of speech I already used, you keep your nose clean. Okay, you do what you're supposed to do. You obey your teachers. You don't get in trouble. With the idea that by doing that, you're going to set yourself on the same track for becoming like your parents. Okay. And then involvement basically is on that path to becoming just like your parents. You engage in all kinds of activities of the kind that don't get you in trouble. Your schedule is filled with activities, not just school, but extrascholastic, extracurricular activities, involvement in sports, in clubs, in music, and so on and so forth, to the point that there's no time for doing anything that's not, strictly speaking, within bounds, within legal bounds. Okay, the very last thing is a little more complicated to describe. I think it's the most interesting idea, especially when you think of that theory of Lawrence Kohlberg's. If you remember Lawrence Kohlberg, theory of moral development, where he said the most superior, most developed form of moral reasoning is one in which it's above reasoning that simply said you should obey the law because it's the law. And you should obey the law because it's the law, because that makes sure that everybody's obeying the law, and that preserves order in society. But the most form of says that sometimes those laws, even though they may keep society orderly, may be abhorrently immoral in violating rights which are should hold universally for all people, right? So you may have a set of property rights. You can't thieve, you can't, take something if somebody doesn't want. But if that gets in the way of that Heinz guy getting that, medicine that could save his wife's life, right, then that may be a bad law. So there's a kind of vantage from which you can judge whether laws are bad laws or not. Okay. So obeying all laws all the time may keep society orderly, but it may keep an orderly society that's a morally bad society, right? That's kind of the idea. What's interesting about this is the best form of control, says Travis Hershey, the strongest kind of measures of control includes a belief in what he called just the belief in legal conventional ways of life. You have a duty to obey rules because they're rules. So he essentially says it's kind of like saying that he's kind of saying that moral reasoning, that stage of reasoning that was basically saying, the law and order, the law and order orientation was the kind of orientation that ensures the most control over, I guess, criminal tendencies. Okay. That's essentially what he's saying. And he says you get this from attachment to your parents. Okay? Kind of growing up early on, you just, without being able to say, you know what, I obey that law because that law, I don't know, some environmental restriction or whatever, polluting or whatever, and you come up with, well, I like that law, right? Because, it helps preserve our natural habitat. And by preserving our natural habitat, it's not only good for, you know, the human environment, but also for other non-human living creatures. And so you give all kinds of reasons. He's saying it's actually guarantees order or control more assuredly if you don't give any reasons. You just say you obey the law because it's the law. If you start having to give reasons for obeying the law, that increases the likelihood that you could reason that a law is not worth following, right? That there aren't good reasons for following the law. So quit thinking about the reasons, just believe in the virtue of the law itself. Anyway, I just wanted to point out that it's interesting that he identifies what he calls belief, a sense of duty to obey rules of conventional society, and that your compliance should be unconditional. You shouldn't give reasons for it. Okay, that he says that's so. Anyway, that's kind of an interesting tension, I think, between theory of social control and what we learned about there. I just want to erase this stuff and go on to the last theory. Okay, so the last theory is called labeling theory. Oh, before I move on, and this will set us up for what I want to talk on Thursday. What I want to say on Thursday. On Thursday, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the criminal justice system and also overall trends in U.S. American society in criminality. So rates of crime, explanations for them, and so on. And so pointing this out will kind of help set up that discussion. So just like strain theory made that prediction about how when the economy gets better, crime goes down, right? So that was strain theory. It made a prediction. Similarly, control theory makes a prediction. And it says that the most important variable is not, necessarily aggregate economic, indicators, whether we're in a recession or not, something like that, but rather the structure or state of the family. Okay, and you can come up with ways of, talking about overall trends in family structure, disintegration of traditional family structures over time. And so it basically suggests that as family structure transforms, but let's say disintegrates. It's kind of a loaded term, but if you have in mind one form of family, you could say that it disintegrates over time. What that's going to do is the whole context in which this control happens gets loosened. So as family structure, disintegrates, you expect crime rates to increase. Okay? And people have actually made that case. There's actually evidence that supports control theory's predictions about crime rates in the United States. Okay. All right, so we're now ready to, we're going to skip that. We're not going to talk about that one. Here's the last theory, a labeling theory. I would say it's actually probably the most famous, most well-known of the many theories of criminality. Maybe rightly so. I think it's an interesting theory to consider. It was developed in the 1950s by this guy named Edwin Lemmer. And so it uses or adopts a symbolic interactionist approach. So it looks at definitions of the situation and suggests that as people collectively agree upon certain definitions, those definitions can over time become something like the real thing, even though it wasn't the case to begin with. And he tells a story about the making of a criminal personality or a career criminal out of material, okay, that wasn't career criminal material, okay, through what's labeling. This is often also called societal reaction or societal response theory for reasons that'll become obvious to you. But here's the story he tells. His theory has the form of a story. Okay? With two main chapters, what he calls primary deviance and secondary deviance. In the first chapter, primary deviance, there's an assumption that is made. And we can try to see if it has any empirical support. We can try to do research if we want to see if we can support this assumption, but we'll just leave it as an assumption for right now. And here's Edwin Lemert says that all of us here, Anna and Molly and Darius and me and Katie and all of us, everyone, we're all deviants. We're low-level deviants. We're infrequent deviants. We're always breaking the rules here and there, just a little bit. And usually it's nothing that serious, right? I don't know, maybe a little shoplifting here, maybe a little speeding there, maybe a little ignoring of that, traffic rule, parking rule, maybe, yeah, who knows? Maybe engaging in a little consumption of, illegal substances. Every once in a while, it happens. And he says everyone does it. And in fact, actually, you can do these exercises in class where people are given a list, like this exhaustive list of possible infractions of rules and laws and so on, and asked to sit down and dig through their memory to think, is there any time in the last few years that you can remember ever doing this? And you start checking it off. And it turns out, once you collect these, and you do it anonymously, so people don't have cold feet, that they feel free to do this, turns out most people are lawbreakers, occasional lawbreakers. So we're all that, he calls that primary deviance. Okay, so and here's the thing about, so, and let me now tell the story by a little character. So let's call her Janie. Okay. Here's the deal with Janie. She's like, I don't know, 4 or 5, and every once in a while she heads right across she lives in this apartment complex and heads over to some convenience store, and she loves, as she must, because it's the greatest candy of all time, she loves Reese's peanut butter cups, right? Loves them so much that, right, they're there, and you see them, oh, you gotta have them. I mean, their power over you is, undeniable, okay? And she's at an age where she's not entirely sure about this monetary transaction thing. It looks like you're supposed to have this like change or money in the car, whatever, okay? And she's like, yeah, I don't want to waste time with that. And every once in a while, down her pockets, okay, goes a Reese's peanut butter cup, and she heads back home or whatever. And maybe this happens every other week or so. I don't know, occasionally. Here's the deal with that's primary deviance, okay? You kind of know you're breaking the laws, it's an infraction, and you do it, but it does not lead you or other people to conceive of yourself as a hardened lifetime criminal. You don't, the way you identify yourself, the identity claim you make to other people is not, I'm a bad guy, right? I'm a bad criminal. I'm a criminal. It doesn't have effect on your self-concept. Secondary deviance. Now Janie, instead of 4, is 18 or 24 or whatever, okay? And what I'd like you to do is to fill in, okay, fill in the blanks of this story in a way that it makes it credible and persuasive to you. She engages, as usual, every so often, just like all of us, in these little, criminal acts here and there, primary deviance, but one time she gets unlucky, she gets caught, okay? And imagine that she gets really unlucky. She runs across, you know, the wrong policeman, the wrong judge, the wrong courts, and so on. Okay, ones that are really restrictive, really tough, really, you know, a hanging judge, as it were. And here's the deal. We call that labeling. She, instead of under the radar, she gets caught. Okay, by the criminal justice system, she gets processed. Okay. There's a file on her now. She has a record. Maybe she even gets brought before the judge. Imagine that her name actually gets publicized. I don't know, maybe it makes it into the local papers or something, and people find out about it. Maybe family, but also friends, maybe even associates, maybe even her employer. Okay, so right there, you could say she's been labeled. That's what that metaphor labeling. Okay, and there's a reaction or response on the part of a significant number of her social circles. Okay, so there's a response to society prompted by judicial personnel. Okay, now here's the important thing, is this is going to lead to a negative response by these people who are alert to the label, who notice the label, notice that, like, she's gotten caught. They're going to give her the cold shoulder. They're not going to talk to her. They're not going to invite her anymore. They're going to turn away when they see her. Her employer is going to either directly fire her or maybe say, you know what, we're cutting back right now. Sorry, but we don't have, right? Non-acceptance that's taking a lot of different forms, and the assumption that's implicitly made here, but I think is crucial, is that non-acceptance for human beings, barring some kind of, you know, neurophysiological aberration, is painful. Okay, it really hurts. And a certain degree of non-acceptance, ostracism, okay, is literally intolerable. We can't handle it. Okay, so there's this labeling, leads to non-acceptance of persons, and in fact, this actually leads to, for the very first time, your deviant behavior has an impact on your identity. At first, because of the way other people are responding to the label. Now you've taken a status dive, right? They see something's gone wrong. There's something not right with you. And you're one of those people. You're a criminal, right? You got, what the heck? What's with that? And that means you've been stigmatized. Okay, so you've heard that term before, I'm sure. Stigma. You've been stigmatized, and it's not good, right? It's a label. It's not good. And literally, what a stigma is, a sociological definition of stigma would be a label that reduces your life chances in a variety of domains. Employment opportunities, opportunities for getting into school, opportunities for gaining entrance into a new set of acquaintances, and so on and so forth. Okay, the quality of your life, the opportunities as you move on, have been reduced because of an identity. Here, one that's been foisted on you from the outside. And then this leads to the stunning climax of the story, is Janie now, okay, experiencing this non-acceptance, having her life chances reduced, finds this utterly intolerable. And so she looks for acceptance, looks for some kind of positive feedback wherever she can find it, because it's too painful not to. And where she's very likely to find acceptance is among people who have had the same kind of experiences she has, who've been similarly labeled, stigmatized as criminals. And then one way of thinking about this is that, okay, so it may be that up until this point, Janie's been kind of refusing or rejecting or resisting other people's defining her, other people's label, which you're no good. She's trying to like convince them otherwise or feel otherwise than that. But finally, she takes an alternative route. And in this new social circle, she affirms, almost defiantly, says, yeah, exactly. I am that person. I am a criminal. If everyone thinks I'm a criminal, then I am. And she finds a social circle in which, instead of a negative reaction to that, she receives a positive reaction. So she receives positive feedback regarding her criminal identity. And the idea there is you have now perhaps created a career criminal, a person whose identity as criminal has been internalized by themselves. And it now becomes a principle of further behavior. It's not going to generate behavior. You're going to try to act in step with your identity. Okay? So that is, that's labeling theory. Let me mention a couple things about it. See what you guys, I'm curious what you think, whether you find this plausible or not. Because let me just point out that it is a kind of, here's where it's, if it's a famous theory, here's where its fame lies, in that it's a really dramatic theory. It's basically saying society can take anybody who didn't have any criminal tendencies at all to begin with, and you can make a hardened criminal out of them sheerly through this kind of chance detection by the criminal justice system. You label them, people react to you, and boom, after a while, the person's, it's almost like personality has been altered as a result of this, and you've now made a criminal where there wasn't one to begin with. So I guess a first kind of food for thought question is, do you find that plausible? Here's another question, okay? And this actually points out a weakness of strain theory. Actually, before I point out the weakness, does anybody want to throw any question marks, pin any question marks to that theory? Say, I'm not sure, it doesn't seem that plausible. Or does anybody have any kind of sense that, yeah, this, I can see this happening. In fact, I may actually know case. This is problematic. This is something that happens in our society. If not, let me go ahead and point out what one of the weaknesses that others have noted about this theory is. And it's the following. So it has to do with that assumption. Whoops. Yeah, so first of all, there is that assumption. It needs to be verified empirically. You know, is it the case that we all engage in this kind of low level, what Lemert calls primary deviance? Okay, let's admit that it does. However, I think in that case, we probably need to make a distinction. Or let me back up and put it this way. Labeling theory has often been seen to be useful in illuminating some of the things that happens to people who've engaged in only certain kinds of illegal actions. Drinking and driving, maybe. Substance abuse, you know, theft, and so on. Well, what about things like murder? Okay, so what do you think? I mean, it's probably not the case that, you know, every once in a while, yeah, I've actually gotten behind the wheel of a car when I shouldn't have, or yeah, I've shoplifted before, but probably it's not like, yeah, every once in a while, you know, you kill somebody and then whatever. Sometimes you get caught, and then right? So that doesn't sound right. right? That sounds unusual. So it may be limited in its scope of application. Maybe labeling theory can only apply to certain kinds of behaviors and not to others. Okay. In which case, that assumption that deviance is kind of universally diffuse is probably not true when it comes to certain categories of behavior, like extreme violent behavior, it might seem. Okay, so that would be a limitation that people have pointed out. I don't know if you guys have any other feelings about it. So look, at this point, we've gone about an hour covering these three theories of deviance. So I feel satisfied at this point. And what I'll do then is I'll stop there. And then what we'll do on my plan for covering stuff, I'm going to cover on Thursday, okay, the criminal justice system, some of the basic, like what categories of crime, how are data on crime compiled, so that we have some sense of what levels of criminality are and how does that affect our perceptions of it, and then crime trends historically in the United States. And there's some really interesting things that are really worth pointing out, okay, about the criminal justice system. Also things like rates of incarceration. It turns out the United States, you guys may already know this, it happens to be, does anybody know where the US ranks in terms of number of people per, say, per 100,000 persons in the world? Ever heard that before? Number one. Okay, so per unit, say per 1,000 persons or per 10,000, per 100,000 persons, there's no country on the planet that puts more people behind bars than the United States. Okay. And you can say, oh, well, that's interesting. Is it anything worth worrying about, thinking about, or asking questions about? Well, maybe if you then discover that the US was not number one, okay, only a few decades ago. A few decades ago, it was way down the list. So in historical time, we become number one in putting people behind bars overnight. Okay. Well, anyway, and that kind of lines up with other trends in the United States in ways that raise a number of questions, like what is the actual rate of criminality in the United States, say over the many decades. So we'll learn about that, and we'll find out what kinds of explanations people have given. Okay, and then probably I'll sort of begin introducing the stuff that comes from chapters 11 and 12, which is on inequality and what's called social stratification, basically hierarchies. Okay. All right, guys. You guys got any questions for me? Any concerns? We'll have right after this week. We've got 2 weeks left. Okay. So anybody downloading this, watching it, okay, here's just a word of encouragement, kind of cheerleading mode. You know, keep on finishing strong. Get in those homeworks. You know, don't let things kind of, you know, sag, as it were, towards the end. If you have any concerns whatsoever, just shoot me an email. Okay. All right, guys. Well, if you don't have anything, I'll go ahead and let you go, and we'll see you again on Thursday. All right, take care.
Thank you.